chapter 35 of Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken. Chapter 35 starts on page 353 if you're following along in your own book. And at the end of chapter 34, Louis and Cynthia had just gotten married. They'd only known each other for a couple of, weeks. Then they got engaged, had a couple months, and then got in a big fight and decided to get married. So it was very last minute on their wedding night. Cynthia was trying to explain to her mom why she got married so quickly, and she was crying, and Louis drank a whole bottle of champagne by himself. Things are not going real well, and Louis is suffering a lot from the trauma that he experienced during the war. So, not a great place for our protagonist Louis, but here we go, chapter 35, Coming Undone. From across the room, they looked like three ordinary men. It was an evening in the latter half of 1946, and Louis sat at a table in the Florentine Gardens, a dinner club in Hollywood, with Cynthia nestled near him. Phil and Cece had come from Indiana for a visit, and Fred Garrett had motored across town to join them for dinner. Phil and Louis were grinning at each other. The last time they'd been together was March of '44, when Phil was being shipped out of Ofuna, and neither man knew if he'd live to see the other again. The men smiled and talked. Fred, who was soon to become an air traffic controller, had a new prosthetic leg. So he has a new fake leg. Remember, he lost it when he was on the island. In a festive mood, he bumped out to the dance floor to show the room that he could still cut a rug. Phil and Cece were, ouch, sorry about that. Okay, sorry, momentarily stabbed my finger on something, but I'm all right now. Okay, anyway, Phil and Cece were about to move to New Mexico, where Phil would open a plastics business. Louis and Cynthia were glowing from their honeymoon, spent sharing a sleeping bag in Louis's beloved mountains, where Cynthia, for all her finishing schools, had proven game for getting dirty. Louis was running again, full of big plans, as garrulous and breezy as he'd been before the war. As the men leaned together for photographs, all that they had been through seemed forgotten. Sometime amid the laughing and conversation, a waiter set a plate in front of Fred. On it, beside the entree, was a serving of white rice. That was all it took. Fred was suddenly raving, furious, hysterical, berating the waiter, and shouting with such force that his face turned purple. Louis tried to calm him, but Fred was beyond consolation. He can't be calmed down. He had come completely undone. The waiter hurried the rice away, and Fred pulled himself together, but the spell was broken. For these men, nothing was ever going to be the same. And that's what this whole chapter and time period for Louis is going to be about, right? They're trying to assume normal life again, but they're recognizing that their trauma has really left its mark. At the end of World War II, thousands of former prisoners of the Japanese, known as Pacific POWs, began their post-war lives. Physically, almost every one of them was ravaged, like their bodies had been destroyed. The average Army or Army Air Force Pacific POW had lost 61 pounds in captivity, a remarkable statistic given that roughly 3/4 of the men had weighed just 159 pounds or less upon enlistment. So meaning they're getting down to under 100 pounds, and that's really small for a full-grown man. Tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, anemia, eye ailments, and festering wounds were widespread. At one chain of hospitals, doctors found a history of wet beriberi in 77% of POWs and dry beriberi in half. Among Canadian POWs, 84% had neurologic damage, so brain damage. Respiratory diseases, like lung diseases, from infections and exposure to unbreathable air in factories and mines were rampant, meaning were everywhere. Men had been crippled and disfigured by unset broken bones, and their teeth had been ruined by beatings and years of chewing grit in their food. Others had gone blind from malnutrition. Scores of men were so ill that they had to be carried from camps, and it was common for men to remain hospitalized for many months after repatriation or after getting back. Some couldn't be saved. The physical injuries were lasting, debilitating, so like altering, stopping their normal life, and sometimes deadly. A 1954 study found that in the first 2 post-war years, former Pacific POWs died at almost 4 times the expected rate for men of their age, and continued to die at unusually high rates for many years. The health repercussions, or after effects, aftermath, often lasted for decades. A follow-up study found that 22 years after the war, former Pacific POWs had hospitalization rates between 2 and 8 times higher than former European POWs for a host of diseases. As bad as were the physical consequences of captivity, the emotional injuries were much more insidious, like much more terrible, widespread, and enduring. So the emotional injuries last a lot longer, they affect more things. In the first 6 post-war years, one of the most common diagnoses given to hospitalized former Pacific POWs was psychoneurosis. So meaning you're having a mental problem, not like a physical sickness. Nearly 40 years after the war, more than 85% of former Pacific POWs in one study suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, characterized in part by flashbacks, anxiety, and nightmares, which we know that Louis has all of these, right? And in a 1987 study, 8 in 10 former Pacific POWs had psychiatric impairment. 6 in 10 had anxiety disorders, more than 1 in 4 had PTSD, and nearly 1 in 5 was depressed. For some, there was only one way out. A 1970 study reported that former Pacific POWs committed suicide 30% more often than controls. All of this illness, physical and emotional, took a shocking toll. Veterans were awarded compensation based on their level of disability, ranging from 10% to 100%. As of January 1953, 1/3 of former Pacific POWs were categorized as 50 to 100% disabled, nearly 8 years after the war's end. So we're just seeing that everyone who lived through these POW camps, like Louis did, had really intense after effects when they were freed and sent back to their homes. These statistics translated into tormented and sometimes ruined lives. Flashbacks in which men re-experienced their traumas and were unable to distinguish the illusion from reality were common. Intense nightmares were almost ubiquitous. They were everywhere, they were common. Men walked in their sleep, acting out prison camp ordeals, and woke screaming, sobbing, or lashing out. Some slept on their floors because they couldn't sleep on mattresses, ducked in terror when airlines flew over, or hoarded food. One man had a recurrent hallucination of seeing his dead POW friends walking past, so he keeps visualizing this over and over. Another was unable to remember the war. Milton McMullen couldn't stop using Japanese terms, a habit that had been pounded into him. Dr. Alfred Weinstein, who had infected the bird with dysentery at Mitsushima, was dogged by urges to scavenge in garbage cans. Huge numbers of men escaped by drinking. In one study of former Pacific POWs, more than a quarter had been diagnosed with alcoholism. Raymond Hap Halloran was a navigator who parachuted into Tokyo after his B-29 was shot down. Once on the ground, Halloran was beaten by a mob of civilians, then captured by Japanese authorities who tortured him, locked him in a pig cage, and held him in a burning horse stall during the fire bombings. They stripped him naked and put him on display at Tokyo's Ueno Zoo, tied upright in an empty tiger cage so civilians could gawk at his filthy, sore-encrusted body. He was starved so severely that he lost 100 pounds. After liberation or freedom and 8 months in a hospital, Halloran went home to Cincinnati. I was not the same 19-year-old Raymond whose mother kissed him goodbye that fall morning in 1942, he wrote. He was intensely nervous and wary of anything approaching him from behind. He couldn't sleep with his arms covered, fearing that he'd need to fight off attackers. He had horrific or horrible nightmares and would wake running in his yard shouting for help. He avoided hotels because his screaming upset other guests. More than 60 years after the war, he was still plagued by poor inventory control, keeping 8 pillows and 6 clocks in his bedroom, buying far more clothes and supplies than he'd ever need, and stockpiling bulk packages of food. And yet Halloran was fortunate. Of the 5 survivors of his crew, 2 drank themselves to death. Some former POWs became almost feral with rage, or wild, like a wild animal with their anger. For many men, seeing an Asian person or overhearing a snippet of Japanese left them shaking, weeping, enraged, or lost in flashbacks. One former POW, normally gentle and quiet, spat at every Asian person he saw. At Letterman General Hospital just after the war, 4 former POWs tried to attack a staffer who was of Japanese ancestry, not knowing that he was an American veteran, right? So they're just taking their anger out on anyone who even vaguely looks Japanese because they're just having such horrific flashbacks. Troubled former POWs found nowhere to turn. McMullen came out of Japan racked by nightmares and so nervous that he was barely able to speak cogently. When he told his story to his family, his father accused him of lying and forbade him to speak of the war. Shattered and deeply depressed, McMullen couldn't eat, and his weight plunged back down to 90 pounds. He went to a veterans hospital, but the doctors simply gave him B12 shots, which is vitamins. As he recounted his experiences to a military official, the official picked up a phone and began talking with someone else. After 2 years, McMullen got his feet under him again, but he would never really recover. 60 years after VJ Day, which is what they call Victory in Japan Day, when the war ended in the Pacific, his dreams still carried him back to the camps. Recounting his war experiences was so painful that it would leave him off kilter for weeks. The Pacific POWs who went home in 1945 were torn down men. They had an intimate understanding of man's vast capacity to experience suffering, as well as his equally vast capacity and hungry willingness to inflict it. Meaning these prisoners understand in a way that no one else really can how much you really can experience or go through suffering and terrible things and survive, but they also understand the level of terrible things that humans can do to each other, which is something we would hope to never understand, but they've seen humans mistreat each other in such extreme ways. They carried unspeakable memories of torture and humiliation and an acute sense of vulnerability that attended the knowledge of how readily they could be disarmed and dehumanized. Many felt lonely and isolated, having endured abuses that ordinary people couldn't understand. Their dignity had been obliterated, replaced with a pervasive sense of shame and worthlessness. And remember, all throughout the book, we talked about how much maintaining your dignity, your sense of self and self-worth and your humanity is essential to staying alive and to having a will to live. And so here we're saying, their sense of dignity was obliterated. It was destroyed. It was smashed or demolished. And instead of having their self-dignity, they're feeling ashamed and worthless. And they had the caustic or burning knowledge that no one had come between them and tragedy, right? No one saved them. Coming home was an experience of profound, perilous, or dangerous aloneness. So they're alone in their suffering. There's no one to understand or talk to. For these men, the central struggle of post-war life was to restore their dignity and find a way to see the world as something other than menacing or like scary, evil blackness. There was no right way to peace. Every man had to find his own path, according to his own history. Some succeeded. For others, the war would never really end. Some retreated into brooding isolation, so just quiet aloneness, or lost themselves in escapes. And for some men, years of swallowed rage, terror, and humiliation concentrated into what Holocaust survivor Jean Amory would call a seething, purifying thirst for revenge. So some people just let this revenge kind of simmer until that is all they wanted. They just wanted to have payback. The honeymoon in the mountains had been Cynthia's idea. Louis loved her for being so sporting and for choosing something so dear to his heart. You must look about you and remember what the trees and hills and streams and lakes look like, he wrote to her before their wedding. I will see you among them for life. Drifting off beside Cynthia each night, Louis still saw the bird lurking in his dreams, but the sergeant hung back as if cowed, or perhaps just waiting. It was the closest thing to peace that Louis had known since Green Hornet had hit the water. The drive back to Los Angeles carried them from the great wide open to the confines of Harry Reid's mother's house. Cynthia was uncomfortable living there, and Louis wanted to give her the home she dreamed of. He needed to find a career, but was unprepared to do so. Having left UFC a few credits short, he had no college degree, a critical asset in a job market glutted with veterans and former war production workers. Like many elite athletes, he had focused on his sport throughout his school years and had never seriously contemplated life after running. Now nearly 30, he had no idea what to do for a living. And remember, Cynthia's only 20, so he's quite a bit older. Here you have a picture of Cynthia on their honeymoon. He made no effort to find a real career or a 9-to-5 salaried job. His celebrity drew people into his orbit, many of them hawking ventures in which he could invest his life insurance payoff, which he'd been allowed to keep. He went to military surplus sales, bought Quonset huts, and resold them to movie studios. He did the same with ice boxes, then invested in a telephone technology. He turned respectable profits, but each investment quickly ran its course. He did, however, earn a steady enough income to rent an apartment for himself and Cynthia. It was only a tiny place in a low-rent quarter of Hollywood, but Cynthia did her best to make it homey. At the end of the first day in the new apartment, Louis slid into bed, closed his eyes, and fell into a dream. As always, the bird was there, but he was no longer hesitant. The sergeant towered over Louis, the belt flicking from his hand, lashing Louis's face. Every night he returned, and Louis was helpless once again, unable to flee him or drive him away. Louis threw himself into training. His long hikes became runs. His strength was coming back, and his dodgy leg gave him no pain. He took it slowly, thinking always of London in '48. He was aiming for the 1,500 meters, and assured himself that if he couldn't make it, he'd return to the 5,000, or even the steeplechase. But without extending himself, he began clocking miles in 4:18, just 2 seconds slower than the winning time of the Zamperini Invitational that he'd seen in March. He was coming all the way back. But running wasn't the same. Once he had felt liberated by it. Now it felt forced. Running was joyless. But Louis had no other answer to his internal turmoil or his trouble and his struggle. He doubled his workouts, and his body answered. One day, with Cynthia standing by holding a stopwatch, Louis set off to see how fast he could turn 2 miles. Early on, he felt a pulse of pain dart across his left ankle, just where it had been injured at Noetsu. He knew better than to keep pushing, but pushing was all he knew now. As he completed the first mile, barbs of pain were crackling through his ankle. On he went, running for London. Late in his last lap, there was an abrupt slicing sensation in his ankle. He half-hopped to the line and collapsed. His time was the fastest 2-mile run on the Pacific coast in 1946, but it didn't matter. He was unable to walk for a week and would limp for weeks more. A doctor confirmed that he had disastrously exacerbated or made worse his war injury. It was all over. Louis was wrecked. The quest that had saved him as a kid was lost to him. The last barricade, the last standing wall within him fell. By day, he couldn't stop thinking about the bird. By night, the sergeant lashed him, hungry and feral, like a wild animal. As the belt whipped him, Louis would fight his way to his attacker's throat and close his hands around it. No matter how hard he squeezed, those eyes still danced at him. Louis regularly woke screaming and soaked in sweat. He was afraid to sleep. He started smoking again. There seemed no reason not to drink, so each evening he swigged wine as he cooked, leaving Cynthia sitting through dinner with a tipsy husband. Invitations to clubs kept coming, and now it seemed harmless to accept the free drinks that were always offered. At first he just drank beer, and then dipped into hard liquor. If he got drunk enough, he could drown the war for a time. He soon began drinking so much that he passed out, but he welcomed it. Passing out saved him from having to go to bed and wait for his monster. Unable to talk him into giving it up, Cynthia stopped going out with him. He left her alone each night while he went out to lose the war. Rage, wild, random, and impossible to quell, began to consume him. So it's like this storm of anger is what that kind of leads us to visualize, and he can't calm the storm. Once he harassed a man for walking too closely on a crosswalk in front of his car, and the man spat at him. Louis gunned the car to the curb, jumped out, and as Cynthia screamed for him to stop, punched the man until he fell to the ground. On another day, when a man at a bar accidentally let a door swing into him, Louis chested up to him and provoked an embarrassing little scuffle that ended with Louis grinding the man's face in the dirt. So he's got this intense anger just always simmering right below the surface. His mind began to derail. While sitting at a bar, he heard a sudden loud sound, perhaps a car backfiring. Before he knew it, he was on the floor cringing as the bar fell silent and the patrons stared. On another night, he was drinking, his mind drifting, when someone nearby yelled something while joking with friends. In Louis's mind, it was Kiri. He found himself jumping back straight, head up, heart pounding, awaiting the flying belt buckle. Remember, that's the Japanese term that the bird would yell when he would jump into the barracks and try and surprise or shock the prisoners, and he would hit whoever was closest. In a moment, the illusion cleared, and he saw that again everyone in the bar was looking at him. He felt foolish and humiliated. One day, Louis was overcome by a strange, inexplicable, undescribable, or unexplainable feeling, and suddenly the war was all around him and in him. Not a memory, but the actual experience, the glaring and grating and stench and howl and terror of it. In a moment, he was jerked back out again, confused and frightened. It was his first flashback. After that, if he caught a glimpse of blood or saw a tussle in a bar, everything would reassemble itself as a prison camp, and the mood, the light, the sounds, his own body would all be as they were, inescapable. In random moments, he felt lice and fleas wriggling over his skin when there was nothing there. It only made him drink harder. So just know here that while Louis has survived the war, he is reliving it constantly. He can't get away from it because his mind keeps pulling him back to there. So he's just continuing to be tortured by this thing that has happened. Cynthia urged Louis to get help, so he went reluctantly to see a counselor at a veterans hospital. He spoke of the war and the nightmares and came home feeling as turbulent or as unsettled and stormy as when he left. After 2 or 3 sessions, he quit, right? Because after just 2 or 3 sessions, he probably stirred everything up. It doesn't feel any better. That's going to take a lot of time, so he quits. One day, he opened a newspaper and saw a story that riveted his attention. A former Pacific POW had called the police who'd arrested, a former Pacific POW had walked into a store and seen one of his wartime captors. The POW had called the police who'd arrested the alleged war criminal. As Louis read the story, all of the fury within him converged. So all of his anger comes together in one focused point. He saw himself finding the bird, overpowering him, his fist bloody in the face, and then his hands locking about the bird's neck. In his fantasy, he killed the bird slowly, savoring the suffering he caused, making his tormentor feel all the pain and terror and helplessness that he'd felt. His veins beat with an electric urgency. Louis had no idea what had become of the bird, but he felt sure that if he could get back to Japan, he could hunt him down. This would be his emphatic reply to the bird's unremitting effort to extinguish his humanity. I am still a man. So the bird has this nonstop effort to make Louis not feel human anymore. And so Louis just keeps picturing the only way he can prove that he's still a man, that he still has his humanity, is if he goes and he gets revenge and he kills the bird. He could conceive or he can't imagine any other way to save himself. Louis had found a quest to replace his lost Olympics. He was going to kill the bird. And with this new, all-consuming passion to want to kill the bird and get revenge, we're going to pause until the next chapter.